view. Okay, so same view. Matthew, Mark, Luke all present a similar view. If you've ever read all four of the Gospels, you notice that John kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, right? Okay, and there's a reason for that. So the Synoptics, when we're talking about the Synoptics, we're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? The Synoptic problem is this. It's the dilemma of how one explains the similarities and differences. So if you've read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you've noticed that they're similar, but they're different, right? They're all kind of unique, but they overlap. So the problem is, how do we blend, or should we blend these stories together? How does that work? Okay. So part of the reason why this is a problem is critics will claim, well, if there's one single contradiction, then the Gospels should be like thrown out. They're not trustworthy, right? So it's kind of like the whole like throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so because a lot of Christians have bought into that idea, then the goal for a lot of them is to respond by attempting to show that the differences aren't really differences. And that's one of the solutions that we'll talk about, is this idea of harmonizing, right? So we're gonna introduce you to this problem by looking at the birth narratives and look at some of the differences tonight. But so if you don't have a problem with the Gospels being different, then you don't have a problem. So we'll talk a little bit about potentially like how this ends up occurring. Like, why are there similarities and differences, right? So part of it has to do with how the Gospels were written, how scholars think that they were written. When we analyze the Gospels and we kind of overlap them here, right, with this Venn diagram, we can see that each Gospel has stuff that's unique to it, right? So 3% of Mark is unique, 20% of Matthew is unique, 35% of Luke is unique. This is what they all have in common, which is a large chunk, right? And this is what only Matthew and Luke have in common. Okay? So this is called the triple tradition. This is because all three of them agree. This is called the double tradition. And then each one has stuff unique. So scholars have kind of asked the question, like, why are there similarities and differences, right? So that gets to the question of who wrote first, kind of the chicken or the egg type of thing. So here is, there's all sorts of theories. Just to be honest, I'm going to give you the dominant scholarly one tonight and just kind of operate off of that, in part because I think it's true, but also because we're not talking about all the theories tonight. So here's the dominant theory, is that there was a source that we don't have anymore, and scholars like to call it Q, and it comes from this word QL. So the idea is we have a source, that we know there was a source, and then Mark wrote first. One of the major reasons that people think that Mark wrote first is because he talks about the temple being destroyed, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and so scholars think that he was writing like right before the temple was destroyed. So that's kind of why they put it in that area. Okay? And then most scholars think that Matthew used these two sources, so this unknown source and Mark, to write his gospel. So he's sitting, you can imagine, like Mark writes first, right? Then Matthew's sitting at his desk, and he's got Mark over here and this other source over here, and he's using him to write his own version of the story. Okay? And then Luke does the same thing. Luke is using this other source, and Luke is using Mark. Luke may or may not have been aware of Matthew. I think there's probably a strong possibility, and he may even hint at the fact that he is aware of Matthew. We don't know. That's kind of speculation. But this is kind of the dominant theory of how. So that starts to shape when you read them. You kind of go, oh, when you're reading something in Matthew that looks familiar in Mark, you can say, okay, Matthew took this story from Mark. He used it mostly. He may have added it, subtracted, done different things to his source text that he was copying from. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is called Markan priority, and it's just the idea that so some of the reasons why scholars believe this is true is because when you analyze the text, most of Mark appears in Matthew and Luke. So it seems like Matthew and Luke are kind of that's the core of the three. That the material shared by all three is closest to Mark. So when you compare like how Matthew and Luke use that material, it looks like they're using it from Mark. And Mark's order seems to be original. And that gets into all sorts of other detail. And then there's also, if we go back here, this material here has something in common. Matthew and Luke have unique stuff, but scholars have said, well, there's got to be a reason why these two have stuff that are so much in common. And we don't think that it's because Matthew and Luke copied Matthew. We think that it's because there's a third source or a second source that we don't have that these two people were using and adapting. Okay. So if we look at like a timeline of how they got put together, we have oral tradition, right? Like Jesus lived, he died, and there's kind of a space where nothing is written down. Stories are just being shared. And then Mark writes in 70, Matthew writes in 85, and Luke writes in 95. And those are just, rough guesstimate dates. Okay? And Luke says something interesting that gives us a little bit of information. Luke says this: many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Okay, so what we learned is Luke is aware of multiple different accounts, right? Which is interesting because, you kind of go multiple, were there others that we don't have? And then Luke also kind of tips his hat that he's not an eyewitness. He's collected the eyewitness accounts. Okay? So that's how the Gospels are similar, right? So we've got the triple tradition, we've got the double tradition, we've got stuff that's unique to them. The problem really comes when the Gospels differ. And so we'll talk about how the Gospels differ in some different places, and then we'll get into the Christmas stuff. Okay, this is all just kind of set up to the problem. So here's how some of the ways, and we're just talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke tonight, just the synoptics. Okay, so there's indication that that there were corrections made. So since the Gospels were written in a certain order, we can see how one author might have corrected another. So for instance, in Mark, Mark claims, in the beginning of his gospel, he claims to be quoting Isaiah. Well, he really takes a quote from Isaiah and Malachi and puts them together. And what it looks like Matthew does is Matthew, in copying Mark, goes, oh, Mark, those are two different quotes. And so Matthew uses the Isaiah quote in the beginning, and he takes the Malachi quote and he puts it later. He separates the two, so there's evidence of if you were using somebody's source and you saw something like that, you might do something like that. It makes sense. Okay. There's also expansion, so you can see a place where somebody takes a story and expands upon it. So Mark narrates Jesus' baptism, and Matthew copies Mark and adds to it. We see omissions. So, for instance, when Luke narrates the Sermon on the Mount, we tend to only, most of us, wouldn't know that there are woes in Luke's gospel because we're so used to Matthew's gospel, right? But in Luke's gospel, there's woes that come after the blessing. But Matthew, I think, is trying to do something theologically, so he leaves out the woes. Okay, so we see omissions, we see alternative versions. So, for example, in Luke, Jesus says one must hate his own family to be his disciple. And Jesus says, in Matthew, Jesus says, he who loves family more than me cannot be my disciple. So same idea, right? But it's a paraphrase and it's changing. It's a small change, but it's a change, right? So really the differences can be categorized into two different things. One is form, and the other is content. So the literary forms of the Gospels are similar because they tell the same story, but the writers appear to, or do, rearrange the order of events for theological reasons. So here's an example. In the Synoptics, Jesus clears the temple at the beginning of his ministry. In John's Gospel, Jesus clears the temple at the end. Okay, so same event, different places in the timeline, and so they took artistic liberty in shifting those around. Okay, the second is content. So we'll see that the literary content is similar, but the writer presents the audience with different content. So, for example, what we're going to look at tonight, only Matthew and Luke record the birth of Jesus' narrative, and they give different accounts. So there's no birth narrative in Mark, and there's no birth narrative in John. Okay? So if we're looking at the beginnings of the gospel, this is kind of how they break down. So Mark, just out of the gate, is like Jesus getting into Jesus' ministry. Mark's favorite word is immediately. So he's trying to tell you stuff short and fast. Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus. Luke begins with the birth of John the Baptist. Luke has a genealogy, but he doesn't give his until chapter 3. And I'll talk about some of that tonight. And then John also begins similar to Mark. Okay? So here's some of the difference in form and content between Matthew and Luke. And you can just see right out of the gate, their form is different, right? These are the first 3 chapters of Matthew and Luke. And the bolded are what they have in common, right? So Matthew gives a genealogy right out of the gate. Luke waits till chapter 3 to do it. They both have the birth narrative of Jesus in Bethlehem, but they're different. They both have John the Baptist preparing the way. But this, you see, this is all original content to Luke. And this is original content to Matthew. Okay? Everybody with me so far? Make sense? Any questions? No? Clear as mud? Okay. This is just, like I said, this is just kind of set up for where we're going. But feel free to interrupt me and ask questions, because I know this is a lot, and it's also we can kind of roll with tonight differently than how we're used to. So similar deal here. This is kind of form, looking at Matthew and Luke, but this is all the way through chapter 5. So you can see the similarities and differences. Just a minute example, right? But it is a difference, is in Matthew, Jesus' sermon takes place on a mount. In Luke, it takes place on a plain, right? Small difference, does it change the content of the sermon? No, right? But if we're being hyper particular, and critics are saying Matthew and Luke can't agree on where the location was, so therefore we should just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, we don't do that just in general in life. I was just in Hawaii, and we were snorkeling, and I took Jen and the kids out to Black Rock to snorkel, right? If you would have been there on the beach when we all got out of the water, everybody would have told you a different story of their experience, right? We all pretty much saw the same things. We went, but each of us as an individual had a different experience of that night snorkel, right? Somebody telling a conflicting story as an eyewitness doesn't negate the fact that we went out and night snorkeled and that happened and then we came back, right? So what I mean by that is we shouldn't be quick to throw the baby out with the bathwater, especially on stuff like this where Matthew's saying they went up and Luke is saying they went down. Make sense? Yeah. So here's 3 different solutions that you can kind of go with this problem. One is you can ignore it. You can just take the ostrich approach and put your head in the sand and say, whatever. Like, it's not a big deal to me. The primary way that Christians have dealt with this issue is to harmonize it, right? So, so if you ask the question, were there shepherds at Jesus' birth? The answer is, depends on which gospel you read, right? But what we tend to do is we tend to take like Matthew and Luke and do this and then tell the whole same story. And the question is, can we do that or should we do that, right? Or should we let them tell their own story and be standalone? What are they trying to do with their stories? So the harmonizing solution tries to take all four of the Gospels, like stir them up and make it all fit to be in a nice, put it up in a nice package with a pretty little bow. And it can be done, but some people will say it can't be done. Some people say it can. That's part of what we'll look at tonight. Is what do you think? Like, do you think we should or can do that? Another solution is to look at the genre of what a gospel was and is, and the expectations of the literary author. And are we holding the literary author to a different standard, right? When you read the lyrics of a song, or when you read poetry, right? It's a different question to ask: is poetry true versus is the science book true? That makes sense? Like different literary genre. So we hold them to different standards. And so the question is, what kind of genre and what kind of standards are the Gospels? Okay? All that's a setup for this, which is what we'll look at tonight. Okay, there's three differences between Matthew and Luke, and they kind of stick out that we'll kind of play with and look at tonight. The first one is genealogy. Matthew and Luke present us with different genealogies. Genealogies can be super dry and boring, but they're also can be potentially interesting, so we'll look at those. I think I was more interested in the genealogies once I knew there were differences than like, if you're anybody like me, like when you're reading the Bible and you start getting into the list of like this begat that, and you're just like, oh my God, skip, right? But hopefully tonight it'll give you a different view of like why the authors are doing that. Okay. The second difference is travels. So if we read carefully, it seems like Matthew and Luke, or maybe it is, that they're giving different details on the travel of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And then the third one is Matthew and Luke appeared to differ on whether the news of Jesus was kept secret at his birth or whether it was shared. Okay, and we'll get into that. Okay? So let's look at the genealogy of Jesus first. These two problems 2 and 3, use the same text, and I just wrote them up here in case you guys want to look at them later, or if you want to pull them up on your phone and look at them now. To have the text in front of you, it's kind of up to you. I'll walk through some of the details on the screen that are important. Okay, so what's interesting about Matthew and Luke is Matthew starts with Abraham giving Jesus' genealogy and talks about fathers. Okay, Luke starts with Joseph, Jesus' father, and works backwards and goes sons of, right? So they're giving genealogies like this. Like Matthew starts as early as Abraham and goes all the way to Jesus. Luke starts with Joseph and goes all the way back to Adam, and he goes even farther back, right? So they're giving similar content, but what happens is what we'll see is they differ. Okay. So Matthew starts by saying there are 14 generations from Abraham to David. There are 14 from David to exile, and there are 14 from Babylon to Jesus. Okay? And as you can see here, these are Matthew and so Luke gives these extra ones. Matthew and Luke agree here. Where they disagree is everything from David to Jesus' birth. And not in a pretty significant way. Matthew says that Jesus comes from David's son Solomon, right? And so Solomon and Nathan are both David's sons. And so David tracks his genealogy from Solomon. Luke tracks it from Nathan. Okay? They both end up at Joseph somehow, but they disagree on who Joseph's dad is. And so some of the solutions that have been proposed is that, so maybe easy to draw this, but so you've got Jesus, right? And you've got Mary and Joseph. And Matthew and Luke disagree on who grandpa is, right? So, people that have tried to harmonize this have come up with all sorts of creative ways to fix this problem. Here's one of them. Some people have said, well, what Luke is really doing is he's giving Mary's side of the family. And what happens is Mary was an only child, and because Mary was an only child, a lot of times what happens with if somebody only had a female daughter, in order to pass the heritage on, Mary's dad would adopt Joseph. So that Mary's dad had a son, then he could pass his inheritance through the son because the inheritance came through the son. So possible, it's a creative example, right? So there's all sorts of different creative examples of how this split happens. So that's one issue. Does that make sense? And I'll give you more of a visual here. Okay, so again, Matthew is working from Abraham to Jesus, and he's talking about fathers. And Luke is working from Jesus to Adam, and he's talking about sons. So with Matthew, there's more than one problem. As you can see, the math just doesn't add up. So Matthew claims that there are 14 from David to exile, but he also claims that there's 14 from exile to Messiah. But there's only 13. So one of the things that people have proposed is, oh, well, he meant to include Jeconiah twice, and he's using this as a hinge to put. So this one should be counted on both. Yeah? Maybe. Right? If we solve it that way, we also have this problem, which is if you just do the math, how many generations total are here from David to the Messiah? 27, right? How many are here? 42. So we're off by a lot, right? I mean, if you just do the math of an average lifespan, 42 minus 27 is what, 15 times, let's just be small and say 40. What's that? What's 40 times?
600? 600?
600. So we're off by
times 15 would be
600 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not a small amount. In addition, if we compare Luke to the Old Testament, Luke's missing some people as well. Okay, so the synoptic problem is how do we solve this issue? Now, just to let you know, it was a common practice to if you're giving a genealogy to give to shorten a genealogy, right? To make it shorter, to include like maybe the more important people. One of the things that's not up here that's interesting that Matthew does, and part of the question as we look at this content is like, okay, the authors did this all for a reason. They didn't just like haphazardly do this. So the question is, why did they do this? Why did they set it up? Did they write it intentionally to record accurate history, or were they doing this maybe for a theological reason? Okay, if we look at Matthew, just looking at his content, okay, Matthew is concerned with the concepts of covenant and kingdom. So he logically progresses from Abraham, covenant initiated, to David, kingdom established, to Babylon, kingdom lost, to Messiah, kingdom restored. Right? So Matthew's got a theme in his genealogy. Luke doesn't have that theme at all. Luke is just like brute facts, right? Like he's just like, I'm just going to list them off one by one, blah, 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 blah. Matthew seems to be taking a creative license with how he's reporting. Matthew also adds 4 women in. He adds Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. So we might go, okay, like why would you add in these women? Well, so here's a little bit about these women. Tamar was an Israelite woman who pretended to be a prostitute to trick her father-in-law into impregnating her. Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute who makes a deal with Israelite spies and saves her husband to make a covenant with them. Ruth was a Moabite woman and the great-grandmother of David by marriage of Boaz. And Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, she's not actually named, Matthew calls her the wife of Uriah, was a woman forced into adultery by King David, her second son, Solomon, and became king after David. So you might ask, like, here's a potential reason. David reminds his audience that Israel's history is full of scandalous stories. This is encouraging them to embrace Mary's miraculous pregnancy, right? So maybe the reason Matthew is saying, hey, remember these women in our story? And he's just kind of like one after another. Potentially is he's not naming them for no reason. The reason is he's putting them in to kind of like nudge and be like if you're having a hard time imagining that Mary got pregnant by the Holy Spirit, like just remember, like we have a scandalous past of all sorts of different crazy things that have happened in our history. Okay. Let's look at Luke. So Luke does something interesting. Matthew begins with the genealogy, which you would expect, right? Genealogies, like you would expect that's like the beginning. Luke bumps his genealogy to chapter 3. So he tells the birth narrative, all this other kind of stuff, and then he butts his genealogy right up to Jesus' baptism. But he does remember Matthew and Luke are doing different things. Matthew is focusing on fathers, and Luke is focusing on sons. So here's why Luke bumps his genealogy into chapter 3. Luke begins with Jesus and works backwards, so he's always saying son of, son of, son of, right? He's emphasizing the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. So he's taken the genealogy, pushed it to chapter 3 because he wants to connect it to the baptism. So in his baptism scene, he has, you are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. And if you notice, if you look at the text, Luke ends his genealogy with son of Adam, son of God, talking about Jesus. So he said son of, son of, son of, all the way back to son of Adam, son of God, right? So he's reporting the genealogy, but he's doing it in a theological way. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions about the genealogy? Thoughts?
You think the fact that Luke was a physician made him think differently about how he wrote it?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I think every author is influenced by like all sorts of factors, right? Yeah.
Luke's definitely more about the details,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I love how he starts it off connecting John the Baptist, the pregnancy of him, with Jesus, and how Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit when that hasn't even been given to us yet. She prophesies when we have no record of her having that gift prior to that. It's just, I love all those details.
Mm-hmm. Does this bug you?
Yeah.
I have to wonder how accurate these sentences was back then.
Well, it's not going to sleep tonight.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I guess I would just, I'd be curious just to talk to the author and just why did they obviously chose to leave some out
Right.
and add some.
Yeah, and I mean, just look at the list. Like from, I mean, they're completely different working backwards, right? We've got Jesus, Joseph, and then boom, it just changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, and then all the way back to here, right?
I kind of like the name Judah.
Does it bug anybody else?
So it just makes me wonder because technically Jesus wasn't biologically related to Joseph, so maybe that was Mary's genealogy and that was Joseph's or something. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay,
Makes sense,
so, but even if you fix this issue, right? You still have
came from David at some point, right?
you still have the number issue,
Right.
right? Which is a huge gap.
Common Core now.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, they didn't
Yeah.
do that.
Which
Yeah.
you could, if you're
Luke
trying
is
to
way
do
ahead of his time.
the harmony method, right, you could just say, well, Matthew truncated his list.
Right.
Could be, yeah.
So then the question would be, why would he do that?
I haven't heard of half of these people. What did they do?
They're all Old Testament people.
Where did they get their? I mean, it's not like you could do a public records request and it was probably accurate. Who knows what kind of records they were finding and were they accurate what they found?
Yeah.
So research back then wasn't like today.
True. So you could say like maybe Matthew didn't have the right information.
That's what he found. He believed to be true.
In
That's
your-
what Luke found, and he believes to be true.
In your opinion, just the personalities of Matthew and Luke,
Mhm.
which one was more precise, would you say?
In prepping for this, I heard a guy say, and I think it's probably fairly accurate, that so there's so remember Matthew and Luke have two sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mark and then the saying source. When they agree, when they use the saying source together, what sticks out is Luke tends to say like, this is what Jesus said. This is what it appears is this is what Jesus said, and Matthew tends to say something more like, this is what Jesus said. Oh, and this is what he meant. Okay, so one example is when they report the blessings. Luke says, that Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor." Full stop. Blessed are the poor. Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," which are two totally different statements, right? If you're rich and you're reading Luke, you're like, I like the Matthew version a little bit better.
Matthew's his own color commentary.
So, Jesus and Joseph read the name on both lists.
Right.
Okay, so you have Levi under Luke twice. Are there two different Levi's?
He's in the second column.
Second column and the
Yeah.
fourth column.
Right
Here.
there, and then
Yeah,
on
and then
forward,
fourth
right?
column.
Yeah.
Are there two different ones?
These are two different ones. Those
Okay.
are
So now, also under Matthew is, I can't read it from here, Zendubadabadabala.
Zerubbabel?
I don't know how to say it, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zerubbabel?
Are those the same people under each, or?
It
I mean,
could
it's not
be.
like it's John is a
Right.
common name.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
So,
I don't know. They could be.
because, if I understand them trying to claim Joseph,
But
in
if-
connection with Jesus,
if
but
they
how
were
does how do those two come into
right, I mean,
play if that's?
it could be one of two things. It could be the same person, but then like neither one on either side are the same, or it could just be like it's a name like David or John or Steve. Like if you're looking at a list of people in America, like you're gonna find common names that overlap at some point.
You have to go into Ecclesiastes and go is related to so and so and so and so and so and so.
So there, I'll give you some reasons why I think they did what they did later. Okay, we'll let the tension sit.
The story according to David.
Again, I'm under Luke, under the L, is that
Yep.
Okay.
So if you have a kid,
Big
is a good biblical name. It's a strong biblical name to name your child. Okay, so that's problem number one, right? That's and that there's all sorts of like parts of that we can talk about. Okay, for time's sake, we'll move on to number two. Okay, so here's number two, and this is more of like a narrative problem. Okay, if we look at the story in Matthew, Jesus is born in Bethlehem in Judea, and I'll give you a map here. So if you're a visual learner like me, it's coming. So just hold on. So for both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Luke gives us a reason why Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He says because Caesar Augustus issued a census. So in Luke's account, Mary and Joseph have to go from Nazareth down to Bethlehem, and that's his reason for moving them in the narrative. Okay. In Matthew, after Jesus is born, they get up and they leave for Egypt because they fear Herod. And then after a time, they try to return to Bethlehem where Jesus was born, but they don't feel like they can, so they end up going to Nazareth. Okay, I'll give you a map in a second. It's easier with a map. In Luke, they go, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Then they go to Jerusalem, which is just next door, so that he can be consecrated at 40 days. And then they return to Nazareth. So there's no Egypt in Luke, sorry. They return immediately to Nazareth. And Luke adds that every year they come back to Jerusalem as good Hebrews did for the festival and for the Passover. Okay, so here's kind of the map. We've got 4 different points here. We've got Bethlehem, we've got Jerusalem, Nazareth is up top, and Egypt is down below. So this is Matthew. Remember, we think that Matthew was probably written first. So Matthew says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They fear for their lives, so they go down to Egypt. They try to go back to Bethlehem, but they can't, so they end up going to Nazareth. Okay? So that's Matthew. This is Luke. So Luke starts them in Nazareth, takes them down to Bethlehem, so they both agree on Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. Then they go over to Jerusalem after 40 days, and then they go back to Nazareth. Okay? So it appears that we could hypothesize different ways to fit the two together, right? Like we could say, so if we're going to make this work, we would say, well, we agree with Luke. They started in Nazareth. Both of them agree that that he was born in Bethlehem. We would have to say with Luke that they went over to Jerusalem, but then Luke leaves out, we would say, the fact that they went down to Egypt, and Luke just forgot about that, and he said they went back to Nazareth. He just kind of skipped over that part, right? So it would be like same thing, like a condensing type of deal. But then we would have to ask, well, like, why did Luke leave that fact out? Okay, so that's problem number 2. Questions or thoughts about that one?
Just running low on ink.
Here's where the one.
Wanted to get their steps in.
Right.
So what's unique to Matthew is the Egyptian story. What's unique to Luke is that they go to the temple and that Jesus is consecrated and that they come back every year. The hard part really, I think, comes in reconciling the two is Luke has to add this little detail that, like, he says, oh, and by the way, they go back every year. Well, if they went to Egypt, it's probably unlikely that they went down to Egypt for fear of their lives, and then they were going back every year.
Yeah.
And then they decided, like, once it was okay, then they went back. Because if you remember, the whole reason they skipped Jerusalem in the first place, which is where they're supposed to be going back every year, is because they don't feel that Bethlehem is safe, which is right next door. So this is one of those ones where it's like, it's possible to harmonize. Is it, like, you just have to ask in your own mind, is it likely or is it
But
probable?
when people do these pilgrimages and stuff like that, which one do they follow? Well, you know, like how they do these, you know, what they feel like a journey of.
Yeah, I mean, most people would just go to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They wouldn't take a pilgrimage to Egypt. No. I'll give you some reasons why I think the stories are where they are. You can mull over, see if you like them or not.
Were they just in fear in that area of Bethlehem and Jerusalem?
Well,
What
so
was the need to really leave the
here's what
nation of Israel?
Yeah, so Matthew tells us that King Herod is living in Jerusalem, right? And what he says is the Magi come to visit him in Jerusalem, and they're looking for Jesus, and they end up the Magi go to Bethlehem and visit Jesus. But then they're told in a dream, right, not to go back and tell Herod. They get out of Dodge because what ends up happening is Herod ends up killing any of the infants under 2, right?
Yeah.
Which, like, I always thought was a huge, like, larger massacre. But from what I've understand from what I've read, like, it probably would have been like 20 kids, maybe 40. You know, the size of the population. So we don't have, the only account that we have of that historically happening, from what I understand, is in the book of Matthew. There's no other real record, but it's not surprising because it wouldn't have been, you know, I mean, it'd be like the mayor of Clovis, well, it'd be much smaller than that, but like, be like the mayor of a small town killing 20 children. Like, it's not surprising that it didn't last as a report.
So how long did they stay in Egypt before, according to?
Well, so Matthew doesn't tell us. He just says that
They just ran to Egypt.
they
hung out
escaped,
for-
until they felt like it was safe, and then they tried, so that's a great question. Timeline wise, you would think, like, if Herod was killing the newborns 2 and under, they waited at least until, you know, he was maybe 3, or, you know, who knows, when they felt like it was safe.
Because if it was just in Jerusalem, Bethlehem area right there, I mean, couldn't they have gone to some of those other little cities down,
Right.
having a
Yeah,
all
and
the way
that-
to Egypt, or just go shoot up straight to Jerusalem? Or
Right,
not to
and then
Nazareth.
the question is too, is at the time, geographically, how far did Egypt extend? Like, did Egypt extend all the way up into, like, Gaza? Because there are people that say, like, potentially Egypt extended all the way up there, so the trip wasn't, like, really truly all the way down here. It was just up in here. If it was all the way through here, they would have gone through, like, a major desert. So it would have been much more
That's
of
a
a...
long way to travel.
Yeah.
Right, with a newborn.
Yeah, when they could have just gone up to Nazareth or
Right.
Nazarene or whatever it is up there.
So, Are the two travels potentially harmonized? Maybe. It seems like you got to do kind of a lot of legwork to make it happen, but it's.
Well, one if they're escaping, it's not like they announced it for everyone to record.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there wasn't social media.
So that's a good segue into the next issue.
Was
Okay.
it secret or shared?
Okay. So here's some more of the detail that we get that we just kind of go like, okay, like if we're going to synthesize these two, how does it play out, right? Because that's what a lot of Christians have tried to do, and the question is, do we want to do that or not, or do you want to do that or not? Okay. So secret or shared. In Matthew, Jesus' birth seems to be kept a secret because they're trying to escape Herod, right? If I'm in Clovis and the mayor's killing little babies, and I'm getting out of Dodge, like I'm probably going to keep that a secret, right? So what Matthew says is the Magi return and avoid Jerusalem. They get out of Dodge. They don't tell anybody. And Joseph and Mary take Jesus and they head off to Egypt, right? Like they go to Bakersfield or LA. In Luke, Jesus' birth seems very much public. So what happens is they wait 40 days until it's time for Jesus to be consecrated. And then they go from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Well, that would be like going into the lion's den, right? Because Herod is in Jerusalem. That's where Herod had his temple. So if they were trying to keep it a secret, like if I had a baby in Clovis and the guy who was doing the killing was in Fresno, like would I go into like over by the mayor's office in Fresno and like go to the temple next door? You know, so that's the question, because they take Jesus to the temple and they offer a sacrifice and they have him blessed, and then Luke adds that in the temple a prophetess Anna meets Jesus, responds by praising God, and then she starts to spread the news, right? So it seems like if we're just looking at the two different texts, right, it seems like Matthew's saying this was kept a secret, they put a kibosh on it, they got out of Dodge. Luke, it seems like Luke is saying like it was a good thing. They went to the temple and they shared the good news. Make sense? Okay. Now that I've frustrated you, let me offer some, like, you know, one of the ways that I think we can reconcile some of this. Part of it has to do with understanding genre, I think. I kind of gave you three different options, right? The ostrich option, stick your head in the sand. One is harmonized. Another is understanding genre. I think it's probably easier to understand these issues as genre issues than it is as trying to synthesize them together. But we have a hard time doing that as like modern scientific minds, where we like just because of the way we think. So let me explain. So pretty much everybody agrees that the Gospels are written in this genre called biographies, right? But the biographies written back then are kind of different than ours are now. So here are 6 common practices that ancient biographies did, which we would probably struggle with as moderns. Okay, so in these modern biographies, they're often shortened. So for example, I'll give you examples in the Gospels of how this is in the Gospels, but there's also examples of this in ancient biographies as well. Okay, so for example, the first one is compression. So a story is shortened. So for example, in Jairus, this man comes to Jesus because his daughter is about to die in Mark. But in Matthew, she's already dead. So Matthew changes the story, which we have a hard time with, right? But what really all he's doing is he's trying to speed up the timeline. He's fast forwarding the story, right? But if we're looking at it from a modern scientifical, like black and white type of thing, it's like, well, when he came to her, was she dead or was she not? Like it's one or the other. Like you've got like, okay. But this was a common practice in ancient biographies. Another one was transferal, so changing who says something in the narrative. So here's an example. Jesus is approached by James and John in Mark. In Matthew, it's their mother. And they ask if they can have authority in God's kingdom. So they, like, if you remember the story, the sons come and they ask Jesus, like, hey, when you come into your kingdom, can I sit in your right and your left? And he's like, you don't know what you're asking for, right? So the question is, who asked? And it was common to transfer the question to someone else, to have them ask the question, right? It's just a way of putting someone closer or further back in the narrative. Okay, displacement, moving an event in a timeline, right? Like us as moderns, we're very much like, what time did this happen? 4:02 p.m., right? Type of thing. They're telling a story, and so they felt comfortable in these ancient biographies moving stuff backwards and forwards. So the example of that is when Jesus clears the temple. So what happens in the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John, in the end in Mark, right? And for us, I think as like modern scientific types, we're like, no, it could only have been one. It's either or, right? But for them, they're shaping the story, and it has theological significance on where they put it because with what they're trying to do. So they felt free to take the puzzle piece and move it in order to place emphasis. It doesn't change whether it actually happened or not, but what they're doing is they're changing the emphasis in the story. Okay. For theological adaptation, so adapting content to make a theological point. I'll show you here in a minute why I think David and Luke have different numbers in their genealogies. It's because they're doing an ancient practice called gematria, where if you were here for the Revelation series, we talked about how numerology was an important part of their literature. And so sometimes they did things like this with names and genealogies to make a point with numbers, because their numbers also represented letters as well. Again, which as moderns we kind of go like, that doesn't make sense for me. Paraphrase, so adding or subtracting or clarifying content. So we talked about this already. Jesus said, "Blessed are you who are poor," in Luke, and then Matthew adds, "in spirit." So Luke could be omitting, Matthew could be adding, Matthew could be interpreting. We don't know. And then the last one is to simplify. So I'm missing those other parentheses there. Matthew often copies Mark, but then leaves out some of the important details, right? And so he just simplifies the story. So like he'll leave out some of like the who, what, when, where. Okay. And I think this is kind of the solution. The answer to the solution is when we look at genre, right? What we expect is the photograph, and what the Gospels are aiming to do is theology. They're still doing history, right? The bird is still there. All of the details, in a sense, are still there. But you would judge a painting, like it's just a different criteria, right? Like a painting is different than a photograph. Does that make sense? And it's a genre thing. It's the same thing when we read the Psalms and it says the trees will clap their hands, right? We don't actually think the trees are clapping their hands, but we understand what the psalmist is trying to communicate. The hard part, I think, for us is like it's a biography, right? So it is like telling the story of historical narrative. But so we have a hard time seeing the gospel writers as both historians and artists. But the ancient biography genre included both of those, both artistry and history. Okay? So here's what I think kind of what Matthew is doing. He's using this practice called gematria to do a couple different things, and I think it's easier if you view it this way, actually. So, I copied this from somebody else, but somebody has proposed like Matthew and Luke are doing very similar things in very different ways. Okay? And they're trying to prove a point with numbers. Okay? So in Matthew, Jesus is the seventh seven. And in Luke, Jesus is the 70th seven. Okay? So you can see how, like, it's probably not coincidence that they just happen to end up like that, like all with sevens, right? What they're trying to do is prove a point. And part of what I think Matthew is trying to do is, so Matthew has 3 sets of 14, right? Does that make sense? And what some scholars have said is, well, that's because he's trying to point to the fact that Jesus is the perfect David. Well, that doesn't make sense to us unless we understand that the number 14 is broken down into 4, 6, 4, which would be, I'm transliterating, I'm tweaking this, but it would be, because the Hebrew doesn't have any vowels, that D, like if I was to take the A and the I out of David, right? It would be DVD. So, which equals 14. And there's 3 of them. So, David is taking artistic liberty in how he presents the genealogy to point to the fact that Jesus is from the line of David and he is the perfect king. He's the Messiah. He's fulfilling the prophecy. Which to us, right, we can very easily get stuck on, like, but no, like, you can't mess around with generations like that. You can't tweak, like, so that's one proposal of what he's doing. Okay? And then the other point is that they're trying to both point to the Jubilee year. In anybody familiar with the Jubilee practice of the ancient Israelites? No, probably not. It's not something we like talk about over coffee all the time. So one of the practices that we think, well, we know it was commanded, we don't know if it was actually practiced, was this practice of Jubilee. Okay, so the Bible and God are kind of big on sevens, right? 7-day creation, and on the 7th day there was what? Rest. Okay, good. Okay, so the practice of Jubilee was that on the 7th 7, so on year 49, which actually was the end of the end of the 49th year, so actually the 50th year. If I had to if I had to go into debt or sell myself into slavery or sell any of my possessions or any of that kind of stuff, and the Jubilee year, all of that, it was like a giant reset button. So all of that stuff, like, got released. Everybody got released from all of their debt, and everything went back to its original, like, family line, right? So one of the things that scholars have said with the sevens is that Luke is trying to point to that Jesus is ushering in the year of Jubilee. And that's what he's doing with numbers.
Reminds me that song that Bull becomes this year of Jubilee. It's in the lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Days of Elijah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I always wondered what that meant, a year of Jubilee.
Yeah. Here's another aspect of Matthew that I think is important to note is Matthew is shaping his gospel around Israel's story and the story of Moses. So he's doing something called recapitulation, which he's retelling the same themes and motifs. So if we look at Joseph in the Old Testament and then Joseph, Jesus' dad, both had prophetic dreams. Joseph in the Old Testament and Jesus' dad in the New Testament, their families end up in Egypt. Moses is rescued from Egypt, Moses is rescued from Egypt, and Jesus comes out of Egypt. Moses is rescued from Pharaoh, Jesus from Herod. Israel passes through the water, through the Red Sea, and Matthew talks about Jesus' baptism. Israel wandered for 40 years in the desert. Jesus was tempted for 40 days in the desert. And then the law was given on Mount Sinai, right? And then Jesus gives his Sermon on the Mount. And Matthew parallels his gospel with the Israel story, right? So whereas, like he's retelling the story, and this is Matthew chapters 1 through 5. So he's like recapitulating, retelling the story, and he's formed it in that way. To also say that Jesus is like the better Moses. Okay? So, if knowing that he's using this motif, it's possible, depends on, you can try it on as a possibility, depending on what solution you want. But some people have said that Matthew is using the Egypt story as a narrative motif. That it didn't actually happen, but he's using that to parallel, because in order to do this parallel, Matthew has to get Jesus to Egypt, right? To tell the rest of
making it fit.
Right. Right. So again, artistic liberty, right? So, but if depending on how you view whether the Gospels need to perfectly align, and if you're reading it as a modern versus an ancient, and the genre and the all that kind of stuff, I think like our guttural initial reaction is to go like, what do you mean? Like Matthew, you can't say that Jesus went down to Egypt, and you can't just use that to like.
But is there anybody else's account other than Matthew?
Only Matthew.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the text going to be? Because you got
It's interesting.
Right.
God
I think the question becomes why there's clear indication that they shaped their narrative intentionally, right? So the question becomes, why did they give the shape that they did to their narrative, right? I think if we look at Luke intentionally he moves Jesus' genealogy right before the baptism to say something about Jesus, right? He wants to say God is up above, John the Baptist is baptizing Jesus, God is saying from heaven, Jesus, you are my son. And so he puts the genealogy right before that to say, hey, look at the genealogy. If we go all the way back, he's the son of Adam, son of God. And then he goes right into the baptism, right? So he's saying something, he's using that story, that part of, as a literary.
Is the difference enough to make people believe differently? Does that make sense? Because when it comes back around, the general story or the general outcome is the same. Kind of, isn't it?
Right, there are a large degree of similarities within, like, overlap in the story, right? So just like if you were to interview my kids and I coming off the beach, right? Like we would all say, yeah, we swam out, we saw this turtle here, we saw an eel, we saw this, we saw that. But like there also would be differences, like how big was the eel? Oh, it was this big. Oh, well, it was this big because I was really scared of it. Or it was, like it was blue. No, it was dark blue. Like, when we interview eyewitnesses from, a robbery or a murder scene or something like that, like, you get part of the differences help you determine what actually, it's something you would expect, right?
Is one more detailed than the other? In their writing, just like within a human being. Could one be more detailed about something as opposed to?
Yeah, I mean each one is different, right? Like Matthew has material that's unique to him. Luke has material that's unique to him. Very little of the Mark material is unique because Matthew and Luke are copying Mark, right?
And don't get us started on John.
Yeah, we won't go to John. John's a whole other story. John's doing his own thing. He's off on.
He's always doing his own thing.
Yeah. So all that to say, there's two different ways that you can solve. There's two different ways you can solve the synoptic problem. There's probably more, but just what I'm presenting you tonight is one is you can synthesize, right, and you can try to like force all of these to fit. The other is you can say, why did they write what they did, and with the genre that they were writing in, what was acceptable and not acceptable, whether we like it or not.
Was there anything with the time that they wrote that they would be trying to reach a different audience that would steer them to do something different?
Yeah, great example. So, like John, if Mark was writing pre-temple destruction, right? You can imagine that his audience, he's going to be writing for a different audience than Matthew and Luke if they had written after the temple destruction, right? That's a huge event that might shape the way the writer wrote their gospel. It does seem that like Matthew is writing for a more like predominantly Jewish audience, and that Luke is writing from potentially a more Greek audience, right? There's like ways that we kind of can look at the text and go like, maybe this person is writing for more, figure out things about their audience, but we don't, ultimately we don't know for sure.
I'm just thinking too, because like we talk about the word being like God inspired, right? So I don't believe that any one of them is like trying to lie or trying to like one up the other one. I think that maybe there is like trying to reach a different audience, or maybe one is condensing because his audience has less attention span, or I don't know, something. But I figure there's got to be some sort of motivation that allows these gospels to reach maybe a different group of people, because God is all inclusive and he wants to reach everybody. So if he can take a different book and do something a little bit different with it, it's for the bigger picture of bringing everybody to him, essentially.
And I think, and that's the key point. I think, like, for instance, with the genealogies, is like, you could look at the genealogies and go like, oh, one has to be telling the truth and one is not telling the truth, right? Like, they don't match, like, it has to be the same. But that's forced. I think if you look at the genre, that's forcing your expectation on what they're trying to communicate versus what they're actually trying to communicate, right? And you're also like anachronistically like putting your expectations now on a genre that was different back then. Yeah.
Would you be willing to go back to that chart with all those 7 on it?
Yeah.
Those 14s between Abraham and David and Exxon and Jesus. What are those 14s?
So in his genealogy, Matthew says there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to exile, and then 14 from David to Jesus.
Where was the 27 from? Was that from?
The 27 was from David to Jesus. So in his gospel, Matthew says, there are 14 between each of these three. But then he provides 14, 14, and then 13.
That makes sense. What do you think on this one?
I think looking at it from like the genre perspective is probably like it's a much, to me, it solves the issues better than trying to like put it all together to force it into one story and figure out how the logistics of like, was it a secret, was it not, did they travel there, did they not, like, I think the better question is why did the author write the story the way they did? I think if you ask that question, then you get better answers.
Is it safe to say that you could possibly make an argument that Luke was speaking more literally and Matthew was speaking more figuratively or artistically?
Yeah, I mean, when you compare the Lord's Prayer, this is an interesting one too. So we have two versions of the Lord's Prayer, one in Luke and one in Matthew. The one in Luke is very like short and succinct, and the one in Matthew is more liturgical. The one in Matthew is the one that we all know. The one in Luke is parts of Matthew. In studying for this, I heard a guy say this, and I was like, really? So in the King James Version, the editors of the King James didn't like the Luke version because it's shorter and it's not. So they took the Matthew version and they put it into Luke. Which when I first heard it, I was like, "What, they did what?" You know? But so to answer your question, Matthew is much more like, this is what he said and this is what he meant. I'm going to expand on this. He's much more like liturgical, pastoral, maybe. So they each kind of have their own bent, right? There's in studying this, there's a guy by the name of, I think it's Mike Lacona, who's done a whole. I think we have like 100 ancient biographies within like a 200-year span of the Gospels, and so he's looked at the Gospels and compared the Gospels to these ancient biographies, and to look at like what the literary style was, what was in common, what wasn't, and he comes up with a lot of this kind of stuff and just says like, look, this was the genre, this is what was acceptable within that genre. They wrote not necessarily in a really like the biography genre that we kind of would expect didn't really come into existence until I think like the 1600s, where you would expect like a biography just to be pure fact like all the way through. But even still, like in our genre of biography, right, like there's all sorts of fudge room with people's history, right? And it's not, it's like, it doesn't change like the big picture and most of like the major things, right? But it's like, people take artistic liberties to make a point. Yeah. What is that? Drums next door.
What is it?
It's a music store.
Yeah.
Drums. Yeah.
So here's
A little percussion with your vacuum mark here.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So like when you hear the story, what I encourage you to do is go home now and read Matthew 1 through 3 and read Luke 1 through 3, and just look at how they tell the story differently. And then maybe on Sunday, when you hear Scott preach, I think he's going to give the narrative, but you can go, oh, that's what Matthew says. That's what Luke says. That's what Matthew says. That's what Luke says. So a couple examples. In Luke, there are shepherds, right, at Jesus' birth. In Matthew are the Magi, right? And so, but oftentimes, like, we take Matthew and Luke and like just jump it all up, right? Like our nativity scenes are a perfect example, right? Like if you have a nativity scene at home, you've got shepherds and magi, and they're all together, right? Well, the shepherds were at Jesus' birth, and the magi didn't come till later, right? And okay, so here's your MythBusters as your parting shot. Okay, there's no donkey. I'm sorry, there's no donkey in Matthew or Luke. There is no inn or innkeeper. The Greek word means a guest room, and they were most likely staying with family. Okay, Jesus was visited by magi, which were Greek astrologers, not three kings. That comes from the song. One of my favorite quotes from a theologian is, Christians don't, Christians don't tell lies in conversation, they go to church and sing lies. which is his deal of like, just because you can write a song doesn't mean it's theologically accurate.
That's funny.
Right? Which, like, this is there were three kings, sorry. Which for me, as like a theologian, it makes it hard as also a musician, because then I'm singing stuff and I'm going, no, I need to tweak these lyrics.
I'm going to change it.
Right. So the number 3 comes from the gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Right? But they weren't kings, they were astrologers because they followed the star. And we don't actually know how many magi there were. So
did you know that Jesus was cold and nobody brought him a blanket? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I saw a funny GIF or meme that was like a whole, like, instead of the magi, it was like a bunch of moms that brought Jesus gifts, and it was like, if it would only been like this, they would have brought like diapers and all the appropriate stuff. They're like, what are we gonna do with gold, frankincense, and myrrh?
Yeah.
And then the last one, no crying he makes, not actually in scripture, just made up a lyric, and it's probably highly unlikely that there was no crying. So those are some of your MythBusters.
I'll say, yeah, he was content.
Yeah. So, they're not long. There's just 3 chapters, but go read Matthew and Luke, and you can kind of see the differences. And let me go back to this slide real quick just to show you. I mean, so those are the differences. I mean, look at all the stuff in Luke that Luke talks about up front before he even gets to Jesus' birth, and Matthew has none of that. So the prophecy,
That's super important. I love that part.
the prophecy of both of their births, Mary visits Elizabeth, Mary's song, the birth of John the Baptist, Zachariah's song, all of that happens before he even gets into Jesus' birth. Cool. Kind of a different Life's Big Questions, but it's a fun issue altogether. Every Christmas, hopefully now when it comes around, you can, like, when you hear the different pieces after you read, you can kind of go like, oh, that's definitely a Matthew part of the story. Or that's definitely a Luke part of the story. You can go home and separate your nativity into the Matthew side and the Luke side.
And we got to bring the dragon in.
Right? And I should make one and just start selling it as a part of like the. Yeah.
Can't be kings in here.
One last question. Any ideas like why one chose Solomon and the other chose?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think they were both wanting to trace it back to David for sure.
Yeah.
It is super interesting that, like, they get back to David in different ways. No idea. It is bizarre. Which also took me down the rabbit hole of, like, David had like 19 kids from like a whole bunch of different wives. I was like, holy cow. I mean, the guy had a lot of kids from also like all sorts of different wives. Yeah. Just whole nother Life's Big Question.
Yeah.
Polygamy in the Old Testament.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Clearly, you don't have to be perfect for God to use you.
Yeah,
Right.
this is true.
Yep. All right, let me pray, and we can in video, and then can hang out and chat or ask more questions or go home. Cool. Father, thank you for your story, your multiple stories. God, I'm reminded of the saying that your story looks the way it does because you let your children tell it. God, we're thankful for that. We know that we are flawed and messy, but God, we're thankful that we have the accounts. We want to gather on these nights to be like Israel, to wrestle with you. And so I pray that wrestling with these things would draw us closer to you. It would make us understand that it is amazing that we have several different stories and they have these things in common that point us to the fact that this wasn't just an accident or happenstance, but that it really happened. God, as we focus in on your birth, I just pray that we would be reminded of the reason for the season, that we would celebrate our coming King, the Messiah, that he sought to liberate